Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of December 19th, 2024. We are coming to you this week from the Read Well department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jebsen House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. I'm doing something a little different this week. We're taking a break from having a guest here on the podcast as we near the end of 2024. I thought it would be a good time, kind of fun, to look back on the books that I've been reading this year. As many of you know who've read any of my blog posts or been listening to this podcast for the 8 years that it's been on, you know that I love to read, I love books, and I find, of course, that there's a whole community of people out there who love to read, who often can't find the time for it, who are constantly looking for ideas about how to help them improve their reading or to get more books into their life or just how to find time to read. So I thought it would be a good time this week to take a moment, pause, look back at some of the books that I've read and just talk to you about some of the tips that I could give you no matter how helpful they may or may not be, about reading in general. I thought it would be kind of fun to take a look at some of the books that I've read this year, some of which you already know about because you've been listening to this podcast and you know I have interviewed the authors. And so I've compiled some statistics. One of the things I think as we approach a new year, people are always talking about, are you setting any resolutions? Are you setting any goals? And it's not uncommon for readers to set reading goals for the year. One thing I can tell you is that I never have a number in mind. I try to read as many books as I can, but I try to read them slowly. I do not read fast. I've talked about this before. I've written about it. I set as my reading goal to read anywhere from 30 to 40 pages a day in the hour to an hour and a half that I set aside every morning to read. This gets us, of course, into the whole topic of when to find time to read, when to do it, some of the common problems I think we all face when we try to sit down as an adult with a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things on our plate and read, when to do that. The first thing I would say is that I don't set a reading goal, as I said, for any number of books that I read. I try to get reading in at least 5, if not 6, if not 7 days a week. Reading on the weekend is harder and harder. But I try to find time on Saturday and Sunday to read as well. A lot of the reading that I do is for my job here at the Georgia Historical Society, and particularly for this podcast. Now, I will say that all the books I have read for this podcast and all the authors that I have interviewed have been entirely of my own choosing. There's no one putting any pressure on me to do any of this. I choose the books first and foremost because I find them interesting, and also in hopes that my audience will find, you, the listener, will find them of interest as well. I try to talk about a range of books across a range of subjects. One thing I think that would be interesting to do is to talk to an author of fiction. I have not ever done that. And I'd like to do that at some point in the future if I can figure out how to make that work. But there are no restrictions on what I read or what I talk about. In 2024, and I'm going to just sort of go at this haphazardly. So I apologize in advance if this doesn't seem to follow a roadmap here. But in 2024, now mind you, as I record this, there's still a couple of weeks left in 2024, and I will finish the one book that I'm reading and move on to another one and finish that one before the end of the year. When I do that, I will have read 48 books this year. That sounds like it's almost a book a week, and I do not think that I have read anything close to a book a week, nor do I try to do that. One of the real gremlins I think we all face is remembering what we read, and I'll be the first to tell you, I can read a book a year ago and remember almost nothing about it. I think it's common for a lot of people to do that. It's not because I don't take notes. I do. It's just the way of the world, I think, particularly as we get older. I did not set a goal to read 48 books. I just set a goal to read interesting books and to go where my reading takes me. Every year, I do set a goal to read some big, important books that I would love to have on my reading list. One of which is The Power Broker by Robert Caro, his magnificent biography of Robert Moses. The book was released again this past year. I think it was in hardback. I got a copy of it. It is a mammoth book, well over 1,000 pages of text. Uh, and it's not that I am afraid to read that much, but there is a part of me, and I think we can all probably, those of you who read can probably sympathize with this. There's a part of me that always hesitates to commit to a book for that long. Even though I know it's going to be interesting, the idea that I may be reading a book for 6 weeks is somewhat daunting, even for me. And I consider myself to be a really good reader. I know how to do it, but there's something. It's a mental challenge that I struggle with sometimes, is committing to a book that's that big, even when I know it's going to be great. Also, because I have to get the reading done for this podcast. It's difficult to find. There's probably 3 or 4 months in the year when I'm not reading for the podcast, and I hesitate to pick up a book that big, which is just silly. I read War and Peace several years ago, Tolstoy's classic. It took me 45 days to read, and that was an average of about 25 pages a day. Very big book, but I was very happy to have read it. So as I get into talking about reading habits, one of the ones I struggle with, that I constantly that I'm at war against, is not letting the size of a book in any way keep me from reading it. Because out of one side of my mouth, I can tell you I don't focus on the number of books I read every year. But when you read a 1,500-page book that takes 6 weeks, that's going to probably bring the number of books down for the year. And that's silly. It's just a silly thing to focus on, in my opinion. Because if you set, let's say I set a goal of reading 50 books a year, experience shows when you do that, you are going to choose smaller books to read, books that don't take as much work to read. And of course, by that, I mean, I think we all know reading something on the bestseller list probably doesn't require as much of you mentally as reading Plato does. I think we know that. So I don't set a reading goal, but every year there's at least 3 books that I would like to have worked my way through. One is The Power Broker, at least until the final volume of Caro's biography of LBJ finally comes out, whatever that is. The second one is a book called by Keith Thomas, written in 1970 or 71, I can't remember, called Religion and the Decline of Magic. I discovered this book in grad school, and I've always wanted to read it. I have a paperback copy on my shelf, and it's about 600 pages. And every year goes by without me having read it. But it's one of those that I would love to read, and will one day. You're probably thinking to yourself, Stan, there's nobody stopping you from doing this. And that's absolutely true. It's just somehow I don't get around to doing it. The other one is a book that I read quickly, as fast as I could anyway, in grad school 30 years ago. E.P. Thompson's, more than 30 years ago, was at the University of Georgia while I was getting a master's degree in Stuart Brown's European history class. It's E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, which is a classic. It is over 800 pages long. It is a big book. It is not a fast read, but it's one of the best books, I think, written in history in post-World War II and in that era. And I, every year, tell myself, this is going to be the year I read E.P. Thompson. So maybe 2025, that will happen. Now, as we go through some of the things I've read, there are other series that I'm working my way through, both in fiction and nonfiction. But the first thing I would just say is, if you set a reading goal, don't set it in terms of numbers. I would be hesitant to commit to a number, because I think when you do that, and I've seen these podcasts and I've seen these YouTube channels where people try to read 100 books a year or 52 books. I just think that's really difficult. I think you become obsessed with a number at that point, and it's really counterproductive. Remember, the idea is to read well. Not to read fast, not to work your way through something, not to get through a book. You want a book to work on you and in you after you put it back on the shelf, and blazing through something, reading as fast as you can, in my uninformed opinion, will not do that. So this year I read 48 books. 18 of those were for this podcast. I didn't set out to do that at the beginning of the year, but there were a lot of really interesting books as you have listened through the year that have come up, that have been published. And there's no secret formula for getting a book on this podcast. I reach out to the author before I start reading and kindly ask if they would agree to appear on my podcast and talk about their book. No one has ever said no. I've had a couple of people who just didn't respond to my emails for whatever reason. But most people, if you can find them either through their publisher or finding their email address on the web, and I always send them, of course, a link to other podcasts so that they can get an idea of what we're going to be doing on here. But 18 of the books that I have read this year, of those 48, came from reading for this podcast, beginning with Elizabeth Barron's biography of Longstreet, which I read back in February. Of course, I also talked to David Henkin about his book, The Week. Talked to David Blight about Yale and slavery, and so on. There were, of course, 3 books that came out from the University of Georgia Press this year, one by Michael Thurman, one by Greg Brooking, and one by Paul Presley that we discussed on here. There's not a single book I read for this podcast that I wouldn't recommend to you. I enjoyed them all across a wide range of subjects, across a wide chronology of history. In reading those 48 books, what I do, I keep a list of the books that I read every year. I have one going back all the way to 1997. And I do write down the page numbers for the book, and I tally that up for the year. So at the end of this year, I'll have read 48 books totaling 16,090 pages. Again, I don't choose short or long books. Some of those 48 books were not very long. I didn't choose them because they were short. It just turned out they weren't very long. I got into a jag over the summer where I was reading books about books. And some of those, including a book that was more like a pamphlet written by Douglas L. Wilson called Jefferson's Books, was only 60 pages long. But I called that a book. So I gave myself credit for that. I read for probably the 10th time Helene Hamp's great epistolary book, 84 Charing Cross Road, which is only 97 pages. I love that book. I read it probably every year, and doesn't take more than a couple of hours in the afternoon to read. But, besides that, of course, I read several other books that were more than 500 pages, including, let's see, the longest one I think I read was John Lewis, the David Greenberg book, which you heard about here just a couple of weeks ago. It was almost 700 pages, 696 pages long. There were several others. Jackie Jones's book about Boston was 532 pages. No Right to an Honest Living. We talked about that one back in August. There were some Jane Calvert's biography of John Dickinson, which you just heard about, was 575 pages long. So again, I'm not trying to, some books are shorter, some books are longer. I just read, I hope, what interests me from one book to another. If I've committed to doing a podcast with the author, of course, I've got to finish that book. I read every word and usually the notes and even skim the index when I interview an author. I want them to know that I have done them the courtesy of reading their books. Now, I could interview an author about a book that I hadn't read, but I think that's doing a grave disservice to the author. I think I owe it to them to read the book, and I want to read the book. It's something that I want to incorporate into my inner life. So 48 books. Well, how does that break down? Well, 18 of them were for the podcast. So I'm going to break it down now, nonfiction and fiction. Probably no great surprise to you that I read more nonfiction than fiction, particularly as so much of it is for this podcast. But I read 33 nonfiction books this year of those, of the 48, so the vast majority. Among those nonfiction, I would break them down this way. I read 8 biographies, some of which you already know about. I mentioned those. 2 memoirs, or what I would call memoir. One of them was Liz Cheney's book, which you will recall she was involved in, of course, the January 6th Congressional Commission. Her book, Oath and Honor, A Memoir and a Warning. I read that back in March. Great book. And I also read a book by Caitlin Doughty called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory. This is a woman who went into the business of undertaking, and she has written several books about that. I'm fascinated, as you know, by death and burial and all of that. I thoroughly enjoyed that. One of the books I read early in the year. I read that book back in February. I read 8 books that I would consider just general histories. Among them, a book by Susie Edge called Mortal Monarchs, which literally goes through every single British monarch and tells you how they died. She has a medical degree, and so she can tell you with great precision in excruciating, sometimes painful detail about how the monarchs died. Other histories that I read, Alan Nevins, his Great Ordeal of the Union, 8 volumes. I got through volume 4, which was The Emergence of Lincoln, volume 2. I got through that back in May. Again, over 500 pages, working my way probably 1 volume a year through Alan Nevins' great 8 volume history of the United States from about 1847 to 1865. Um, I read Rick Atkinson's second volume of his Revolutionary War trilogy. He asked me to read this. I read the Word version, which came to over 1,100 pages. The book itself is not going to be that long, but I was very privileged to read that. Rick's going to come on here later on in 2025 and do a podcast with me about that book called The Fate of the Day, The War for America, Volume 2. So that was a great thrill. So 8 books, of course, in general histories. 5 of the books I read were books about books, which I always thoroughly enjoy when I can find a good book about books. Those ranged from Jeffrey Roberts' book that I read called Stalin's Library, A Dictator and His Books, back in January. In fact, it was the first book I read this year. A wonderful book about Stalin as a reader and the fact that his library still exists there in Moscow. He wrote in several of his books. Very discriminating reader. As I mentioned, I got on to kind of a jag this summer where I got interested in Jefferson and his books. Kevin Hayes has written a series of books about people and their life in books, how they read their way through their life. Jefferson, well, he's written about him. He's written about Patrick Henry. And I read his book called George Washington, A Life in Books back in June, 390 pages. Thoroughly enjoyed that. I read a book that was called Three Presidents and Their Books, the reading of Jefferson, Lincoln, and Wilson. Thoroughly enjoyed that. So, and you know that I read and interviewed earlier this year Evan Friss about his book on bookshops. The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Read that in August. Thoroughly enjoyed that. But anytime I can find books about books, I love to read those. So I read 5 of those this year. General nonfiction. 9 books. This covered more probably than I read in nonfiction, general nonfiction. And what do I mean by that? Well, books like the Clayton Schroeder volume, Loserville, which I read earlier this year. The Secret History of Bigfoot, general nonfiction, read about that. The Week, A History of the Unnatural Rhythms That Made Us Who We Are, David Henkin's book. I am currently, or I'm going to be reading, the book by, I think it's Oliver Berkman's book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. This goes right along, I think, with the whole idea of time and what we do with it and what we do with our time. So a lot of general nonfiction books that cover a host of topics, things that don't fall neatly into any category. You know, I'm just trying to look through my list here to see what else. Of course, I read Adam Nagorny's great book about the New York Times called The Times, which I read for this podcast. I read a book called Is Something Up There, which was written in the 1960s about UFOs, a book that my brother acquired many, many years ago through school. You will recall in the 1960s and 70s, you could order books from you'd often bring home a list of books, and your parents would let you buy books, and he bought a couple. And this was one of those that I discovered this past year, brought it home, and read it. is something up there. Not a very long book, less than 150 pages, but really interesting book about UFOs and where that kind of stood at that time that the author was writing. The author was Dale White, writing in the 1960s. And I read one book of essays, and that, of course, was Michel de Montaigne's great essays, complete essays of Montaigne. I read the final one third. I split that book up into thirds, and I read the first third back in 2022, the second third last year, and of course finished it this year. This is by the Donald Frame edition. He's the great translator of Montaigne. He's also the great biographer of Montaigne. I read those back in April and highly recommend those. Those sort of fall into, of course, also the great books category. Montaigne's essays are something that I think you can read and reread with great profit for the rest of your life. So that's one of the series, I call that a series, that I finished this year. I mentioned Alan Nevins. I've gotten through 4 volumes of his Ordeal of the Union in 8 volumes. So 33 books that I read were nonfiction. Again, I don't think that's any great secret. Most of what I read, at least probably 3/4 of what I read. And let's just see. So in this case, about 68%. So probably 2/3 of what I read is nonfiction. It just happened to fall out that way this year. Now, that means that I read 15 books of fiction, which is also very interesting. I read 12 novels, 2 collections of short stories, and one book I wasn't sure where to put it. This is a book called Birds Aren't Real, the true story of mass avian murder. Can't remember what the rest of that title was. Written by Peter McIndoe and Connor Gatos. It's nonfiction, but it's fiction. I think I called it nonfiction. Of course, it's the whole, if you're familiar with that Birds Aren't Real movement, you can look it up. This is a book that's written tongue in cheek. This is a spoof. This is written as if this whole thing were real, the great government cover up of the birds aren't real. You can read more about it. I read that book this year just because, and it's not a long book at all. It's about 250 pages. Won't take you long to read it, and it's kind of fun. But of the other books I read, 12 novels, and I enjoyed every single one that I read. I finished reading the second and third volumes of Julie Schumacher's Dear Committee trilogy, the first volume of which is called Dear Committee. This is an academic campus novel, and I thoroughly enjoyed these. The second volume is The Shakespeare Requirement. The third is called The English Experience, and I really enjoyed those. Not difficult to read. The Shakespeare Requirement is about 300 pages. The English Experience, 230, not long, and a lot of fun. Keeping in the genre of campus novels, I also read Mary McCarthy's 1952 novel, The Groves of Academe. Didn't enjoy it as much as I hoped I would, but a very famous novel written right in the middle of the McCarthy period and the Red Scare on campus and sort of how that played out on one fictitious campus in a fictitious English department. Thoroughly an interesting read, and I don't regret reading it. Very, very, very interesting, particularly for its time. I think it still speaks to us. Speaking of trilogies, I also read Jane Gardam's Old Filth, which is the first volume of her trilogy of Sir Edward Feathers, who was known as Old Filth. He's a retired judge struggling to come to terms with the death of his wife. This is the first volume in a trilogy, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, much more than I thought that I would. I reread a novel that meant a great deal to me when I was in high school, Richard Adams' Watership Down. I read it when I was in 11th grade. I read it again about 2 years later when I was a freshman in college and hadn't really touched it in 41 years. But I reread it and it spoke to me as much now as an adult as it did when I was a teenager. Highly, highly recommended. There have been a lot of adaptations of that novel. There have been movies, there have been cartoons. I have really not watched any of those and really don't want to. I don't want it to mess up my vision of this book or the way I think about it. But it's a book that I will return to. I think there's just so much going on there, and I'm not going to attempt to describe Watership Down to you. It's a book about rabbits, but it's so much more than that. Thoroughly enjoyed reading Watership Down again. Two books I read were in the Easton Press 100 Greatest Books Ever Written series, which I subscribed to, I think, back in 2007. The very first volume that appeared was in my mailbox was, of course, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. I had never read it until that point. Loved it. I have got about three or four books left in the 100 greatest books. Now, mind you, I've written about this before. They're Easton Press's 100 greatest books, and I put quotes around that. I don't know how they arrived at these books. There's a lot of holes in this list, as you would imagine, and a lot of omissions. But I read two books this year that were in that series. I read Voltaire's Candide, first published in 1759. This is probably the 10th time I've read Candide. You can read it in an afternoon. It is a wonderful novel that has so much to say about the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss, Candide, and all of his friends and their adventures. I also read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, first published in 1899. Can't say that I loved it. I liked it better than Lord Jim, which was also, I mean, I'm not sure Joseph Conrad deserves two books on a list of 100 greatest books ever written. But I did read Heart of Darkness, and I got through that. And by the way, and in Montaigne's essays, not included because, again, it's too big, I think. Should be, obviously, is one of the greatest books ever written, in my opinion. I also read John D. MacDonald's Bright Orange for the Shroud, which is a Travis McGee novel. I started reading those about 12 years ago. It's the sixth novel in the Travis McGee series. I think there are 21 novels in this series. I'll have to check that. This one was written in 1965. They all have a color in the title. I'm a huge fan of Travis McGee. It's pure escapist. It's something to cleanse the palate. Sometimes when I can't figure out what genre I want to go to next, I'll read one of John MacDonald's Travis McGee novels. So I read that one this year. Also this summer, I read Feral Sam's The Whisper of the River. This book was published in 1984. It's the second book in what you might call the Porter Osborne trilogy. It's based, I think, loosely on Sam's life growing up before and during the Great Depression. This book was a follow-up to the 1982 run with the Horseman, which I read last summer. That one made me laugh out loud. Whisper of the River I didn't think was quite as funny, but equally good. This is a wonderful trilogy. And I received these books, this first two, as a high school graduation present 40 years ago. And why it took me this long to read them, I'm not sure. But you know what? When I finally read them, I was ready to read them and ready to receive the wisdom that were in both of these books. And I thoroughly enjoyed them. Feral Sam's was a doctor who decided late in life to start writing. And he wrote these somewhat fictitious versions of his own life. And they are a great source of fun to read. Quite moving. I also read a book by Robert Silverberg, who is a long accomplished writer and award-winning writer of science fiction. This was, again, a book that my brother bought many years ago when he was in school. This is Revolt on Alpha C, which, of course, is Alpha Centauri. This is the book that launched Silverberg's career in 1955. He is still writing. He's 89 years old. I read this book back in August. It's not very long. It was fun to read. Pure escapist. I mentioned that I read some short stories. In October, I always like to read scary stuff, and I read the second part of E.F. Benson's collection called The Ghost Stories of E.F. Benson. I discovered E.F. Benson, who was the author of the Map and Lucia series, if you're familiar with those. I discovered E.F. Benson from reading Michael Dirda. All of his books, he always recommends great books. E.F. Benson was a writer I wasn't aware of until I read Gerda, and so I spent part of October reading the ghost stories of E.F. Benson. I read another collection, and I broke the book up into thirds, so that I'm reading. I read a third last year because it's about a 600-page book, and so I'm just reading them a third at a time. I've also got a collection of stories called Great Supernatural Stories, 101 Horrifying Tales. I read the second part of that book as well as part of my October spooky reading. So again, a lot of. I'm sure I'll read at least that many novels again in 2025 when I am not reading for this podcast or reading a good biography or good history, I've certainly tried to branch out and to read more great fiction. Now, one of the things I didn't read this year is any poetry. I mean, I read poems, but I did not read any collection of poems, and I should remedy that in 2025. So I read 33 nonfiction books, 15 fiction. Of those, 12 are novels, two collection of short stories, and then Birds Aren't Real, whatever that is. So that gives you some of the ideas of the books that I read. If you've listened to this podcast, you know about the books that I read for this. Just going and looking at my lists, any other books that I read that might be of interest to people that I did not read for this podcast. I've covered just about all of them. One of the biographies I read this year was by a historian named Marie Kimball, who set out about the same time as Dumas Malone to write a multi-volume biography of Thomas Jefferson. Unfortunately, she died after the third volume had been published, which only takes Jefferson's life through about 1789. But I read the first volume called Jefferson, The Road to Glory, 1743 to 1776. It was about 350 pages long. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not as good as Malone, but that's a steep hill to climb. But I did enjoy that. As I mentioned, I read Rick Atkinson's book, which will be published, I think, in April or May of 2025. You'll be able to get that. The other books I think you know about because I've talked about them already. So that's what I read this year. 48 books. Still got there's 2 podcasts to come that won't be out until 2025. I've completed reading those books. I should tell you about those now. One is Christine Rosen, who works for the American Enterprise Institute. She has written a book called The Extinction of Experience. And the subtitle is Being Human in a Disembodied World. The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, published by W. W. Norton this year. I read about this book in the Wall Street Journal, and it's really all about the impact of all the technology in our lives on what it means to be human. And it sounded really interesting to me. I asked her if she would come on the podcast. She graciously agreed. So that will probably be the first podcast that launched in 2025. I'm also reading Christopher Cox's new biography of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, of course, spent time in Georgia. It's called Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, and it really focuses on Wilson and his role in the suffrage movement and the passage of what was known as the Anthony Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. It is a fascinating book. I am just finishing it up. I'll be talking to the author, Christopher Cox, early in January about that book. And the last book that I'm going to read this year, as I mentioned, is Oliver Burkeman's 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. His premise, of course, is that we have roughly 4,000 weeks in our lives. What are you doing with them? What are you spending that time doing? So if you're listening to this, one of the things that I know that you are spending time doing is reading, just like me. And I don't think I could read 48 books in the year if I did not make it a point and set aside time to read every single day. I think it's very, very important to do that. And I've written about this a little bit. Back on June 5th, 2018, as part of the What I'm Reading Now series that I did for a little while as a blog post, I wrote about how I set aside time. I get up very early, earlier than most people would ever want to be up. I get up at 4:30 in the morning, and I read for about an hour and a half before I exercise. And it's not because I like to get up that early, but in part, it's the only way I think that I could get a certain amount of reading done every day. Because like most people, once the day gets going and you're at work, you can't do it. And at night, I'm just simply too tired. It's hard to mentally focus on reading, for me anyway, late at night. Now, it might work for you. I think the first key here, and whatever goals you set to read, whether it's reading more or just reading well, in 2025 is to find a time to read that works for you and guard it. One of the reasons I like reading that early is because all the goblins and gremlins that come at you as a reader are sort of neutralized when you read that early in the morning. One of them is the guilt goblin that comes after you when you read. That is when you're sitting there reading, and if you're reading, I'll make this up. You sit down to read at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you look and you go, I should probably vacuum the carpet or the rug because it looks filthy, or I really need to go pick up the dry cleaning, or I should go to the grocery store, or I should do whatever. When you read at 4:30 in the morning, it's not that you'd be doing anything else except sleeping. And I am willing to give up that amount of time to read every day because in one sense you can do it without any guilt. It's not a matter of I should be responding to that email, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. It's just not a time of day when you would be doing anything else except sleeping. And I'm willing to give up that time to meet my reading goals. So I think it's very important to find a time to read and guard it, whatever that is for you, whether it's first thing in the morning, and it need not be for an hour and a half. It can be for 10 minutes. It can be for a half an hour. It can be at night before you go to bed. If you can read with comprehension and focus at night, put aside everything, then that's when you should do it. Maybe the middle of the day because if your schedule works for you. Whatever it is, find the time to read and guard it. I think if you read 25 minutes a day, 6, 7, 5 days a week, you will be astonished at the amount of reading you can get done in one year. So in terms of setting reading goals, I would think about goals just in terms of reading every day and how much you want to read every day. And then let the numbers, let the page numbers, all of that will take care of itself. I would not be focused on trying to read a certain number of books because, as I said, that may then drive your reading. I think it's good to read slowly. The idea that you need to rush through a book or read a certain number of pages, I will tell you, there are some books where reading 30 or 40 pages in the time I spend reading is much, much, much easier. I mentioned Julie Schumacher's trilogy of the Dear Committee. Those books do not take nearly the brain power, and I don't mean that they're just fluff. They're not fluff, but it's not closely written. It's not densely written. There aren't as many words on the page as reading, for instance, David Blight's book on Yale and slavery, a totally different kind of read, where maybe reading patiently 25 pages is the goal that I set because I want to give the book the time it really deserves. So I would say read slowly. Don't focus on getting a certain number of pages read. I just tell myself I need to get that number read in order to work through a book. One of the things I'll tell you that for these podcasts is when I contact an author, I will say, let's try to talk on, and I'll make this up. Let's try to talk on March 25th. And when I contact them, it's March 5th. Part of that is driven by the fact that I know how big their book is. I know about how fast I can read every day. And so I give myself plenty of time to read slowly. I underline. This is another point. A lot of people just want to take notes. You may or may not take notes in a fiction book, but certainly if you're reading nonfiction, you may want to take notes. You may want to keep a notebook or a pad of paper handy. You may want to underline in the book and then go back later and write down what you've underlined. That's what I do. But I wouldn't hesitate. This is just me talking. You do what you want to do, obviously, but I write in all of my books. There for a long, long time, I would not write in my Easton Press books because I thought these books are too valuable. At the end of the day, I don't have any books because of their monetary value. They are there simply to work for me. They're like tools. I do care about the way that they look. I prefer a hardback over a paperback if I can get it. I will take a cover off a book and put it on the shelf so that I don't handle it and mess it up while I'm reading. But I do not hesitate to underline words. I will star the margins. I will write words in the margins. I will write notes on the end paper. I always write in the front when I got a book, where I got it, and then on the very back, the day that I started the book and also the day that I finished it, just because I like to keep up with all of that. But I am not afraid to writing my books. And there are people who say, well, you've ruined the value. If you're collecting books in a library because you want to be able to sell it later as a whole, then maybe you don't want to write in them. I don't particularly care about this is going to sound I don't really want to buy a book that somebody else has written in unless it's some famous historian. I will tell you that if I can find one of David McCulloch's books, for instance, that he read and I get his underlining and his notes, I'd love to have that. It's an association copy, by the way. Um, but I'm not really worried about who comes after me and whether they care to read all of that. For me now, I want this book to go to work for me. I want to absorb what I've read. One of the things that helps me do that is writing in my book. So read slow, take notes, underline. One of the other goblins that I think that we all have is the idea that you can't read unless there are perfect conditions. You don't set out to do that, but for a lot of people, the room temperature has got to be perfect. The light's got to be perfect. It's oh my goodness, this cup of coffee or this cup of tea is not exactly what I had hoped. I've got to, my shoes don't feel. I mean, I'm cold. I need a blanket. It's raining outside. Or whatever it is. There's never going to be a perfect. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. So don't let that stop you. uh, I think that goes along with the guilt. The idea that you should be doing something else, that reading is not a productive part of your day. As an adult, there are all these other things you should be doing. And I think that we need to be gracious with ourselves. Reading is also, I think, a form of self care. And I think that's very important. And don't let yourself be guilted into not doing it. Now, I will say, when I was growing up, my mother, God love her, and I sure do, um, she herself, and she knows this is true, she is not and was not a reader. And when I was growing up, I loved nothing better than to read. I read a lot of comic books, as you know, if you've heard me talk about this before. I read anything I could get my hands on. But if I tried to read on a sunny day, my mother tried to make me feel guilty about that. You should be outside playing. If my father was home and outside working, which if he was home and it was daylight, he was usually outside working. She would say, you need to be out there with your dad, helping him do whatever it was he was doing. I longed for rainy days. And I think a lot of us carry that kind of guilt about reading into our adult lives. That it's got, if you're going to read during the day, it's got to be when it's raining, or otherwise you're in some place where you just simply can't get out and run errands or cut grass or paint or whatever it is that you think you're supposed to be doing. I think reading without guilt is one of those monsters and those dragons that any reader has got to be able to slay at some point. It can be difficult, and I know that you'll come up against it, but just keep working and pushing back against it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with reading whenever you want to read, whenever that is. Just do it. And again, nothing's ever going to be perfect. The conditions aren't going to be perfect. I do think if you're reading in the morning before it's daylight, you need good light. You need a comfortable chair. Which also, there are going to be days when you're not mentally present for your reading. I will tell you that there are many days during the year when I am distracted, even at 4:45 in the morning. I'm thinking about what happened yesterday, or I'm thinking about what is going to happen today, or what's going to happen next week. I'll think about work, or I'll think about some other project. Any number of things might be going on that keep you from being mentally present in your reading. And you know what this is like. You can read a page and you have no idea what you read. This often happens when you read at night. You're recapping the events of the day in your mind, and you're not mentally present. And I will tell you, when you're reading The Power Broker, or you're reading David Henkin's The Week, or you're reading anything that takes some concentration, and whatever that is, even fiction, you need to be mentally present. And you're not always going to be. If you set a goal of reading 363 days a year, whatever, there are going to be a lot of those days, maybe one out of every four, where you're not mentally present. So push through it. Keep reading anyway. Maybe that day you read 15 pages instead of 30 or 40 or 50. That's okay too. Maybe you go back tomorrow and reread everything you read today. That's okay too. Just keep reading. Understand that all of this is common. Even the best readers have those kinds of days. Just keep reading and push through it. You're not always going to be mentally present. For some people, if they don't read every day, they kind of lose their way as a reader. They'll start a book in January and then life intervenes and they'll come back to it in March and go, gosh, I don't remember anything I read. I find my bookmark here, but I don't remember any of this. What do I do? I feel like I'm stuck. I feel like, first of all, I got to get through this book before I can get through another one. Well, you don't. You can do whatever you want. You can put that book down and start another one. Don't let reading become a project. Don't let reading become like a weight loss program or an exercise program where if you feel like you dropped the ball, you've failed on the project and the project is now no good. You can start reading again at any point, any day, any hour. And you don't have to finish reading anything you ever start. You can put it down and pick up something else that interests you more. Maybe that book interested you in January, but because life intervened, now you pick it up again in March and you don't want to finish it. That's okay. Read what is on your mind. Read wherever your reading taste take you. I think it's very important to do that. And don't let reading become a project. Don't ever feel like you've got to quote get through a book. I've got to get through this book. You're not reading to get through a book. You're reading to absorb what it has to say, to enjoy the written word, to think about whatever the message is inside. If it's a nonfiction book, if you're reading about ways to improve yourself in some way, absorb that message, read slowly, take notes, think about, try to be mentally present. But you're not trying to get through it. This is not a project. You're not in school. This is not an assignment. You're reading a book because you want to read that book. You want to absorb or be entertained. Absorb the information or be entertained, whatever it is. But don't let reading become a project. So these are some of the things that I would ask you to think about as you go into 2025, to read more books, to read fewer books, whatever they are. Maybe you want to read fewer books because you want to read bigger books that are on bigger subjects. Maybe this is the year that you're going to get through Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War. Maybe this is the year that you're going to read The Rise and Fall, or The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. Those are great goals. If you decide to read one of those books for the next 6 years to get through Gibbon, then that's okay too. Whatever you decide to do in terms of your reading, find a time that works for you to read. Read slowly, take notes, underline, whatever it is you need to do in order to retain some of that information, or so you can go back to it later and refresh your memory about what that book had to say to you. Don't worry about a perfect time or perfect conditions. There will never be. And I would also encourage you not to put off reading until you're retired. I think we all think that the day is coming where we're going to have endless amounts of time to read. And I don't think it is. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Even if we make it to retirement, I think that there will be plenty of things to distract us. And there's nothing wrong with watching television, watching movies, watching Netflix. Those can be part of your goals too. I know plenty of people who want to work their way through this 10-part series and that 10-part series, and there's nothing wrong with that. Make reading a part of your life in the same way that you always make time for other kinds of entertainment. One thing where I haven't talked about, and I'm not sure I want to get into, is listening to books, Audible or anything else. Back in the day, they were called books on tape. You can really get them almost anywhere now. Is that reading or isn't it reading? Are you really reading a book if you're listening to someone else read it to you? I don't really want to get into that conversation. There's nothing wrong with making that a part of your life as well and enhancing your reading. If you're listening to a book while you're exercising, while you're cooking, while you're doing house cleaning, while you're doing yard work, I think that's perfectly fine. If you want to keep a list of the books that you've listened to, do that too. In any way that I think you can incorporate the written word into your life is worthy and worthwhile. I wrote a blog post on August 7th of 2018 called Paper or Plastic, where I talked about reading on your Kindle or some other electronic device. Was that like reading a book? Well, it's a different experience. Reading print and reading text are two different things. But I think anytime you read, you're asking your brain to do something, as Marianne Wolf has told us, that it wasn't really genetically wired to do. Reading is something that I think we have to learn how to do. And there's nothing wrong with reading a Kindle. If that's the way you decide to absorb a great book or the latest bestseller, that's perfectly fine. If you'd rather carry a Kindle or your iPad or read on your phone into the doctor's office instead of lugging the Power Broker or War and Peace, I think you lose the opportunity to impress all the fellow people waiting in there with you if you do that. That's kind of funny. But however you decide to work more reading into your life in 2025, I wish you success. Don't let anything stop you. Don't get discouraged if life intervenes. If you set out to get up early and you can't do it, if you set out to stay up late and can't do it, just keep reading. You'll find what works for you. Take it slowly. Don't be too hard on yourself. Give yourself some grace because I think the rewards will be immense. So I wish you good luck in reading in 2025. Those of you who listen to this podcast sent in some great feedback about my recent podcast with Jane Calvert on her book on John Dickinson, one of the founding fathers of the United States. Very soon after that podcast aired, I received news from Jane Calvert that the funding for her John Dickinson writing project from the NHPRC, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, had been denied for next year. Now, this is a devastating blow to the project. It comes at a time, as I mentioned, they have produced 3 of a projected 13 volumes. They have been producing some of their best work. They're functioning very well, and this comes as a devastating blow to their funding. Now, for those of you who care about this kind of thing and who would like to, if you can, continue to support the John Dickinson Writings Project, I would direct you to write directly to Jane Calvert. She can tell you more about what to do at dr.janeecalvert@gmail.com. That's dr.janeecalvert@gmail.com. So very quickly, while I've still got you here, I talked about books, and I'm going to take 1 minute. it's going to be longer than a minute, but it's my podcast, so I'm going to do it anyway. This has nothing to do with books. I'm just going to talk really quickly about the college football playoffs. Those of you who came to listen to the book can probably jump off now if you want to. But I've got a rant about this. I haven't been able to do this in months, but the college football season is over. The 12-team college football playoff has been set. This is the first year of the 12-team playoff. In years past, they chose 4 teams. The University of Georgia last year lost 1 game. That was the SEC championship to Alabama by 3 points, and we got completely shut out of the playoff. The 12-team playoff, of course, is designed to do to remedy something like that. But as we all knew, this year, we would start arguing over who was number 13, not who was number 5, but who was number 13. There were 12 teams. Famously, the University of Miami and the University of Alabama both got left out. Miami with, I think, 2 losses because of when they lost. They lost 2 of their last 3 games. Alabama had 3 losses, 2 of them to unranked teams, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. It all started becoming an argument over who had the best resume, who had the hardest schedule, when did somebody play, when did they lose? Did they lose early in the season? Did they lose late? There was a sense with Alabama that somehow Alabama is just entitled to make the playoff every year. They lost 3 games this year. Ole Miss lost 3 games. Other teams lost 3 games. Miami only lost 2, and they got shut out. They were kept out of it because they lost momentum. They lost 2 games at the end of the season to Georgia Tech and to Syracuse, and it became about when they lost. In the NFL, there's a certain threshold you have to meet to get into the playoffs, and it doesn't matter whether you lose in September, the first game of the season, or the last game of the season in December. If you get in, you get in, you get in, and it doesn't matter. And I think that should be the same in college football. When you lose, should have nothing to do with whether or not you get into the playoff. But once again, it seems to be arbitrary and capricious about how these things work. Um, you know, are all conferences the same? Does Boise State deserve to be in the top four because they won their conference? No. Let's just say it. No. They don't play the same kind of schedule that other Big Ten teams play, or even Big 12 teams. The SEC gets a lot of, they're sort of like the king of the hill, but come on. I mean, all conferences are not created equal. There never will be that kind of equality in college football. This is not the NFL where any given week a team can win. But I don't think Alabama deserved to be there. They lost twice to two unranked teams, and I don't think anybody else who did what they did would be even part of the conversation. But every year we have to listen to this. And I'm not listening. If you're a Bama fan, I know they beat Georgia. I mean, we were down 28-0 to that team. They look like they could have beaten the New England Patriots at the height of the Tom Brady era that night, and that seems to have been the height of their season. That first half of that Georgia game was, I think, Bama's season. I will say, as a Georgia fan this year, this is one of the most excruciating seasons to watch. This was excruciating to watch because it seemed like we had a great season. We only lost two games, and it seemed like we lost every game. If you watched Georgia this year, they always had a terrible first half. They somehow couldn't get it going. You're screaming at your television. You're screaming about Carson Beck. Why didn't they put a backup quarterback in there? And yet somehow we won all but two games. One game we didn't really show up for was the Ole Miss game. We almost beat Bama. And yet here they are in the college football playoffs. They get a first round bye. They're going to play on New Year's night in the Sugar Bowl. So it's been excruciating to watch, and it probably will be in the next go around too. But college football, man, there's nothing like it. It is a lot of fun to watch. I love just about all sports. I love baseball, as you know. I don't think they got it right with the 12-team playoff. I think that the whole seeding business is messed up, but they'll figure it out. But anyway, I just had to rant a little bit about this year's college football playoff. Finally, one last thing about sports. You may have heard, if you follow baseball at all, and we're not in the middle of baseball season, we're in the middle of the Hot Stove League, the winter meetings where teams are signing free agents and making trades to improve, hopefully, their team. There's been a lot of discussion about something called the golden at bat in baseball, and will it come to Major League Baseball? Now, what, you ask, is the golden at bat? If you think about other sports, basketball, hockey, football, it is not difficult when you're in a tight game and the game is on the line in the closing minutes or closing seconds to get the ball or the puck into the hands of your best player. If you're in football, you want to get the ball to that receiver or that running back or in the hands of your quarterback who can make a difference, who can really do something. In basketball, if Steph Curry's on your team, if LeBron's on your team and there's seconds left, you want the ball in their hands. And it's not always that difficult to make it happen. In baseball, your best player may have gone out in the eighth inning and struck out. And so you lead off the ninth inning down by 3, and the bottom of your lineup is coming up. The golden at bat would allow you to, at least once a game, insert your best player anywhere in the lineup you wanted them. So even if Matt Olson struck out to end the eighth inning in Game 7 of the World Series, with the golden at bat rule, he could start off the ninth inning. He could come up in the eighth inning twice if the manager wanted him to. The golden at bat is bringing your best player up when he's not due up. As you know, in baseball, there's a lineup of 1 through 9, and they bat in that order. And you can pinch hit for somebody, but you can't change when somebody bats. The golden at bat would allow you at least once a game to do that. Rob Manfred, the baseball commissioner, created quite a hullabaloo in the last couple of weeks by suggesting that Major League Baseball is having this discussion about bringing the Golden at bat, and the traditionalists went crazy. How could you do this? You will overturn seemingly hundreds of years of tradition by having something called the Golden at bat. Manfred was quick to say, we're only talking about it, and there's a long, long, long way to go before we implement something like that. I don't know where I stand on this. I think it would be great fun to have your best player. If you're the Atlanta Braves and Ronald Acuna is having the kind of year he had last year, and he bats in the 8th inning, and then you've got the bases loaded in the 9th inning, and you need a grand slam. Imagine being able to bring him up when you wanted to bring him up. That would be kind of fun. On the other hand, if you're on defense and you're pitching and you strike out Shohei Ohtani, why would you have to face him again immediately? That's part of the strategy and the fun of baseball. So I don't know where I stand on this, but because we're talking about sports now at the end of this podcast, I thought I'd just throw that out there. The Golden at bat, something to watch for in the future of baseball. We shall see. I hope you've enjoyed these podcasts in 2024, and I hope you come back next year for more. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path Fireball soccer team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our chief accountant is Candace B. Rittenoff. Our holiday airline ticket reservation manager is Will Price Randomly. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftis. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar Lavista. The conductor of the Off the Beaten Path Holiday Symphony Orchestra is Philip Harmonic. The staff physicist is Momentum. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. The manager of the Off the Beaten Path membership refund program is Wendy Pigs Fly. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The official Off the Beaten Path holiday decoration specialist is Aretha Holly. The holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iapoka. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow, like, and share, please. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar read well or well-read podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.